The grand ballroom was bright with hundreds of shiny lights hanging from the ceiling. Everything looked fancy and rich. The air smelled like expensive perfume and bubbly drinks. Waiters in neat uniforms walked around carrying trays of drinks. This big party, called a charity gala, was one of the most important events of the year. Famous movie stars, rich business people, and high society guests were all here. Women wore sparkly dresses and shiny diamond necklaces. They walked around, talking politely to men in fancy suits. Outside, a long red carpet stretched out and flashing cameras clicked as important guests arrived in expensive cars. Then she arrived. Sandra Bullock stepped out of a simple car. No bodyguards, no group of people with her. She didn't try to get attention. She wore a plain but beautiful gray dress, no big jewelry, no extra sparkle. Her hair was tied up neatly and she wore just a little makeup, making her look naturally pretty. She walked down the red carpet with a calm and quiet confidence. Some photographers took pictures of her, but they quickly turned to look at two other women stepping out of a big fancy black car. These women were Isabella Cartwright and Vivian St. James. They were not just rich but also known for being mean and judgmental. They wore bright gold dresses and huge diamond jewelry. As they passed by Sandra, they looked at her from head to toe with judging eyes, not even trying to hide their disapproval. Then Sandra heard the first whispers. When she entered the ballroom, she felt people looking at her, but not in a friendly way. The looks were not of admiration but of quiet judgment. She knew she didn't look as fancy as the other guests, and in this room, looking rich and glamorous was very important. But Sandra reminded herself why she was here. She came to support a good cause, to help children who needed help. She reached for a glass of champagne, but just as she was about to take a sip, she heard something that made her stop. Poor Sandra. Did no one tell her this is a gala, not a casual dinner? It was Isabella Cartwright speaking. Her voice was sweet, but her words were full of poison. Vivian, standing beside her, smiled in a fake, sympathetic way. I do admire her effort, really, but some people just don't understand how these events work. Sandra's stomach tightened. She wasn't surprised that they were being mean, but it felt different hearing them talk like she wasn't even there. Still, she didn't show any reaction. She just took a sip of her drink and walked away. But the night was just beginning. Sandra tried to talk to different people in the ballroom, but something strange was happening. The most important guests seemed to ignore her. Not because they didn't like her as an actress, but because, in their unspoken rules, she didn't seem important enough for them. Sandra felt a little uncomfortable, but she stayed calm. I'm here for the charity, she reminded herself. Then a waiter walked up to her and spoke softly. Excuse me, Miss Bullock, but your seat has been changed. Sandra frowned. Changed? To where? The waiter hesitated. To a different table in the back. For a moment, Sandra felt the sting of what was happening. She wasn't just being ignored, she was being pushed aside on purpose. And she had a strong feeling she knew exactly who was behind it. Across the room, Isabella and Vivian exchanged satisfied looks. Sandra took a deep breath and walked toward her new table. It was far from the main stage where the most powerful guests sat. It felt like she had been sent away from the important crowd. But before she sat down, she noticed something. Isabella and Vivian were watching her closely, waiting for her reaction. Sandra smiled softly at them, a knowing smile, and then gracefully took her seat. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. But deep down, she knew this night was far from over. She tried to focus on the event, listening to speeches about the charity. But something felt off. She noticed Isabella and Vivian whispering excitedly. Something had caught their attention. Curious, Sandra leaned a little closer to listen. Then she heard a name that made her freeze. Keanu Reeves. Vivian whispered his name in a secretive way. Sandra frowned. What did Keanu have to do with any of this? Isabella chuckled. Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it. Sandra felt a shiver run down her spine. The way they said it didn't sound good. She kept her face calm, but inside, her heart was beating faster. What was happening? The ballroom was full of energy. Guests were now sitting at their tables while waiters served fancy food and poured expensive wine into glasses. Sandra already knew who was hosting the event, Keanu Reeves. This charity gala was one of his most important projects. He had invited Sandra himself, telling her that her presence mattered. That's why, when she realized her seat had been moved to a less important place, she felt confused and disappointed. There's no way Keanu knew about this, or did he? She wondered. As Sandra sat at her new table, she noticed that the whispers had not stopped. It wasn't just the stares anymore, it was the words. Isabella and Vivian were in the middle of it all, talking and laughing. Isabella's voice rang out, pretending to be surprised. Funny how this event brings together all kinds of people, don't you think, Vivian? Vivian smirked. Oh, absolutely. Some people may think they belong here just because they were invited. But being invited doesn't mean you actually fit in. Sandra held her wine glass steady, feeling a quiet fire inside her. She knew they were talking about her. But what hurt the most wasn't their words, it was that no one else seemed to care. Sandra tried to ignore them, but things only got worse. More and more important guests ignored her. Some gave her small, fake smiles, while others acted like they didn't even see her. She couldn't believe this was happening at Keanu's event. She had known him for years. She knew he cared about kindness and helping others more than anything else. So why was she being treated like she didn't belong? As the waiters served the main meal, one quietly placed a small folded note beside Sandra. She picked it up and read the words. Sandra darling, I hope you're enjoying yourself. If you ever need a proper dress for next year's event, I know some wonderful stylists. Kisses, Isabella. Sandra's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a small mean comment. It was a direct insult made in front of everyone. She squeezed the paper slightly in her fingers and looked up. Across the room, Isabella and Vivian were watching her, their lips curled in amusement. Sandra took a deep breath. She wouldn't let them see her react. But now she was sure of one thing. Something bigger was happening and she needed to find out what. She wasn't leaving. But she needed a moment to calm down. She quietly stood up and walked outside to the garden. The cool air brushed against her skin. She took a sip of champagne and tried to think. Keanu invited me. He knows I don't care about fancy things. So why am I being treated like this? She thought. But she wouldn't have much time to figure it out. Just as she was about to return to the ballroom, she heard two familiar voices. Isabella and Vivian. They were standing near a side entrance, speaking softly but excitedly. Sandra didn't care what they were talking about, until she heard one name. Keanu Reeves. Sandra's heart started beating faster. What did Keanu have to do with them? Vivian laughed, her voice full of secrets. Oh, he has a special surprise planned for tonight. I think Sandra will love it. Isabella smirked. Or maybe not. Sandra felt a chill go through her. They didn't sound happy about it. Something was going on. And for the first time that night, Sandra felt truly afraid. Sandra tried to quietly walk away from the people talking about her, but before she could leave, she heard one of the women whisper Keanu Reeves's name. The way she said it made it sound like he had a big surprise planned for the night. Sandra didn't know what the surprise was, but she wasn't in a hurry to find out. She walked back to the ballroom, taking her time. She already knew exactly what kind of people Isabella and Victoria were. They were the type of women who only cared about being important and making others feel left out. They thought that being rich and fancy made them better than everyone else. But the funniest part? They actually believed Sandra cared about any of it. As she walked, she grabbed a glass of wine from a passing waiter. She looked around the room. From the outside, the event looked perfect. Big smiles, friendly conversations, and fancy dresses. But now Sandra saw the truth. It was all an act. And the worst part? Some people were really bad actors. She noticed how the people around her changed the moment they saw her. Earlier, they had greeted her warmly, smiling and talking to her. Now they wouldn't even meet her eyes. They suddenly became very interested in their food. Others gave her long, slow looks as if they were trying to measure her up. As if they were trying to decide if she belonged here. Sandra almost laughed. It was so ridiculous. Did they really think a simple dress and no fancy jewelry made her invisible? That just because she wasn't dripping in diamonds, she wasn't important? Poor souls. If they only knew how little she cared about their opinions. She reached out and grabbed a small snack from a passing tray, casually ignoring the silence around her. She wasn't going to let their silly little game bother her. Across the room, she noticed Victoria watching her closely. Victoria leaned toward Isabella, whispered something and then smirked, making sure Sandra saw. Sandra sighed internally. This was like something out of a bad high school movie. Two grown, rich women acting like mean girls trying to play a game of social exclusion. How childish. Sandra decided to turn the game around. Instead of looking uncomfortable or upset, she did the opposite. She looked directly at Victoria and gave her a big, real, effortless smile. Victoria's smirk disappeared. She wasn't expecting that. She had been expecting Sandra to look embarrassed, maybe even uncomfortable. Instead, Sandra lifted her glass in a small toast and took a slow sip of her wine. Victoria's face stiffened. She hated losing control. And in that moment, she realized something important. She had no power over Sandra at all. Sandra looked around the room again and saw someone familiar, Michael Whitmore. He was a famous actor and known for his charity work. Unlike most of the people here, he actually seemed to care about more than just looking important. For a moment, Sandra thought about going over to talk to him. But then she noticed something that made her pause. Michael was talking to Victoria, and he was listening to her. Victoria was leaning in close, speaking softly, her expression calm and controlled. Michael nodded as if he believed whatever she was saying. Sandra didn't feel angry, but she did feel disappointed. Michael was smart. He should know that women like Victoria love to twist the truth. And yet, here he was, listening to her as if she was telling the most important story in the world. Maybe Michael wasn't as trustworthy as he seemed. Sandra sighed. It was a shame, but not a surprise. She went back to her table and picked up her fork, absent-mindedly twirling it in her fingers. She could feel the glances around her. She could hear the hushed whispers. But none of it bothered her. In fact, she found it all very funny. These people took themselves way too seriously. Did they really think this ballroom was the most important place in the world? That what dress someone wore mattered? It was laughable. She took a bite of her food, wondering how much longer she had to sit through this ridiculous event. Then, a woman at the table next to her spoke up. She looked nervous. Sandra, can I ask you something? Sandra looked up. Of course. The woman hesitated before speaking. I heard some people saying that, maybe you're only here because of Keanu. Sandra let out a small laugh. Isabella and Victoria, right? The woman looked a little embarrassed but nodded. Sandra leaned forward, resting her elbow on the table. She looked the woman in the eye. Tell me, do you really think Keanu invites people out of pity? The woman blinked. I don't know. Sandra smirked. Sure you do. But it's easier to pretend you don't. The woman flushed and quickly looked away. Sandra took another sip of wine. The silence at the table was delicious. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. By now dinner was winding down. Soon, Keanu Reeves would go up on stage to make a big announcement. Sandra knew one thing. Keanu had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes tonight. But she also knew that once he spoke, everything would change. Because Keanu didn't play these silly social games. Isabella and Victoria thought they had power. But Keanu had something they could never buy, respect. Sandra glanced toward the stage. The real fun was about to begin. Finally, dinner was ending. All eyes turned toward the stage as the host stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Before we close, we have a very special guest, the man who made this event possible. Please welcome Keanu Reeves. The whole room clapped loudly. Sandra sat back and finished the last sip of her wine. Finally, the moment had arrived. Isabella and Victoria sat up straight, watching closely. They looked like they were expecting something amazing. Sandra, on the other hand, was simply curious. What exactly was Keanu's big surprise? Keanu walked onto the stage with his usual calm, easygoing attitude. He took the microphone, waited for the applause to die down, and then began speaking. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. This cause is very important to me, and seeing so many people come together to support it is truly incredible. The audience clapped again. Keanu continued. Many of you know about the work this organization does. But tonight, I want to talk about someone very special. Someone who has helped in so many ways but never asks for attention. Sandra raised an eyebrow. She wasn't expecting this. This person has given so much to this cause, not just with money but with time, effort, and heart. And that person is Sandra Bullock. The entire room went silent. Then applause erupted. Sandra stayed calm, but inside she was amused. She glanced over at Isabella and Victoria. They looked stunned. Keanu smiled. What many of you don't know is that Sandra has been one of the biggest supporters of this cause. She's helped make sure these projects go further than we ever imagined. The applause grew louder. Sandra smiled, not because she wanted the attention, but because she loved seeing Isabella and Victoria's faces. Isabella tried to hide how uncomfortable she was. But Victoria? She looked furious. Their plan had completely backfired. Keanu turned to Sandra. Sandra, if you don't mind, I'd love for you to come up here. More applause. Sandra took a slow breath and smiled. For a moment she thought about saying no. But then she saw Isabella and Victoria's faces, shocked, frustrated. She couldn't resist. She set her glass down and stood up. She walked toward the stage with confidence. Every step felt like a quiet victory. Keanu smiled warmly as she reached him. Thank you, Sandra. He handed her the microphone. The stage was hers. Sandra looked at the big crowd in front of her. She didn't write a speech, but she didn't need one. I think it's funny how people believe doing good things means getting attention. I never cared about being famous. Helping others is something you do because it's right, not because you want people to see it. People in the crowd started whispering. Sandra kept talking. Being here tonight and getting this award is surprising. But it means something because it reminds me that what really matters is not how we look but the difference we make in the world. Some people looked down, feeling guilty. Two women, Isabella and Victoria, sat very still. Sandra's words felt like they were meant just for them. She finished speaking with a small smile. The whole room clapped loudly. Sandra gave the microphone back to Keanu and walked off the stage. As she passed Isabella and Victoria's table, she stopped for a moment. She looked at them, tilted her head, and softly said, "I hope you enjoy dinner." Then she walked away. Neither of them said a word. Victoria held her wine glass so tightly it looked like it might break. Isabella forced a small smile, but it was clear she had lost. Sandra sat back in her chair, picked up her drink, took a slow sip, and smiled to herself. Now the night finally felt worth it. As people kept clapping, Sandra noticed something. Victoria leaned toward Isabella and whispered. Sandra couldn't hear the words, but she saw Isabella's face change. She looked worried. What were they planning now? After everything that happened, what more could they do? After Keanu's speech, the whole room felt different. People started to look at Sandra in a new way. Earlier, many ignored her, but now they wanted to talk to her. People who never cared before were suddenly acting friendly. Sandra saw their fake smiles. She knew the truth. They weren't different people. They just didn't want to be on the losing side. That didn't bother her, but it didn't impress her either. Isabella and Victoria still sat at their table. But they no longer looked confident. Victoria still held her glass, but she wasn't smiling anymore. Isabella, always calm, tried to look fine. But it was clear she wasn't. All the whispers, all the plans they had made, they had all fallen apart. And worst of all, they had done it to themselves. They believed looking rich and powerful made them better than others. But in the end, that didn't matter. The truth always comes out. Sandra didn't want to waste more time on them. But as she walked past their table, she heard Isabella whisper, "She can act like she doesn't care, but deep down, she just wants to be accepted like everyone else." Sandra stopped. Slowly, she turned around. She pulled out a chair and sat down at their table. She crossed her legs, picked up her drink, and took a sip. Then she looked at Isabella and said, "Isabella, if I wanted people like you to accept me, I would have dressed in diamonds just to be worthy of this room. Don't you think?" Isabella's face froze. Victoria looked away. Sandra kept talking. "You tried all night to bring me down because you think power comes from fancy clothes and knowing the right people. But if tonight proved anything, it's that real respect can't be bought." Isabella forced a small smile. "You're overreacting. This event is for people like us." Sandra tilted her head. "And you really believe you're at the top, don't you? But look around. Who do you think people respect right now? Because from what I see, it's not you." She looked Isabella straight in the eye. "And the funniest part? You did this to yourselves. If you had just treated me like everyone else, none of this would have happened." Silence. Victoria opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She knew there was nothing left to say. Sandra smiled. "Good luck fixing this." She stood up and walked away. Isabella and Victoria said nothing. This time they knew they had lost. Sandra walked over to Keanu. He had been watching from a distance. He lifted his glass. "Well played." Sandra smiled and clinked her glass with his. "If they think they can ruin me with gossip, they don't know how patient I am." Keanu chuckled. "You know what's funny? People hold on to status like it's the most important thing in the world." Sandra nodded. "I saw so many people act differently after your speech. Like your words suddenly decided my worth." Keanu sighed. "People need others to tell them who to respect. But real respect doesn't need approval." Sandra looked at him. "That's why you never play this game. You never cared about pretending." Keanu smirked. "And neither did you. That's why we get along." Sandra laughed. "Do you think people will remember this night?" Keanu shrugged. "Some will. But most will keep believing that money and power are the only things that matter." Sandra glanced at Isabella and Victoria. They weren't smiling anymore. "And others will remember it forever." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, some will." Sandra and Keanu walked out of the ballroom together. Before getting into her car, Sandra looked back at the event. It had started with lies and fake smiles but ended with the truth. She turned to Keanu and smiled. "I think we learned something tonight." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Sandra opened her car door but paused. She looked at him one last time and said, It doesn't matter what you wear, who you know, or what people think of you. She smiled. The only thing that truly matters is who you are when no one is watching. Keanu smiled back. And you've always known that. Sandra stepped into the car and Keanu watched as she drove away. The event was over, but the lesson from that night would last much longer. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.